Happy Easter, everyone. One of the oldest possessions I have, or rather I should say, the thing I've possessed for the longest, not necessarily the oldest thing, is a little cloth bracelet I got as a child. It's old and has taken on some grunge in its age, and it was never really meant to be an archival sort of item. It was probably something given to us kids at school, though I can't exactly recall. But in any case, it's sort of pinkish purple and has a plastic clasp of that same color with a little bunny's head shaped cutout. And on the band it says those two delightful words, Happy Easter. Happy, of course, and is hopping. Not the most novel pun, but it makes me smile. And every Easter I try to dig it out and put it on my wrist. Again, it's just some cheap junk that's thrown at children for a holiday, and I did not intend initially to forge any tradition out of it. It just happened that I'd find it amongst my things, and I never happened to throw it out. It's a little unusual that I still have it. There's no definitive repository of my childhood belongings. Between having limited space growing up, moving houses, and other little things here and there, most things I've had are gone. I don't have the childhood bedroom frozen in time or the attic where memories are neatly boxed up, which is all just to say that it's curious this little trinket has lasted so long with me, and its persistence has carved out some measure of sentimentality in me. I think about it every Easter now. When I dig it out and look at it, I always think, every year, I really should throw this thing away. I never will, though. I love it because I love Easter. It's a beautiful time of the year, and not just because I myself was born on Easter Day. I remember being discontent as a boy with my childlike reasoning that, despite being born on Easter, each of my birthdays weren't on Easter. I wanted my birthday to be just whenever Easter was that year. I wasn't greedy. I didn't want 2 birthdays, just the one, always on Easter. I couldn't articulate it at the time, but I hated the irregularity of the Hebrew calendar. But my selfishness never stopped me from enjoying Easter. I love everything about it, the bunnies, the painted eggs, the chocolate, the pastel colors, the resurrection, all of it. It's a lot like Christmas, just holidays of joy, religious ones, yes, and very important to Christianity, but also embodying a faith-independent sort of joy that's so welcoming and accessible that you'd have to be a real cunt to reject it. I've spent plenty and too much of my life being pessimistic, cynical, depressive, melancholic, and otherwise gay and annoying. I've put my time in, and I don't have anything to prove, so I'm not afraid to be ecstatically basic and unapologetically happy when it comes to Christmas and Easter. And for clarification, I'm not a religious person. I'm white and American, so I'd consider myself part of Christendom, but I'm not a worshiper or a believer. And where I'm not a smarmy 15-year-old, I don't like the term atheist, because I'd just rather not define myself in the negative. But I did have my little Richard Dawkins phase, and even so, I don't let my lack of faith in the Bible bar me from enjoying the beauty of tradition and the holidays. If you're Jewish and have a Passover and Hanukkah, that's fine, or if you're Muslim and have whatever analogs or emphatic lack thereof for religious reasons, that's fine too. By all means, do what's in your faith. But if you're a person broadly in the sphere of Christendom, in the area, and a descendant of Christians, even if you'd rather not identify as such yourself, why not celebrate it? It's fun. And I don't intend to make light of it in the eyes of the faithful. Again, I know that they obviously hold important religious meanings and are not these sterile, consumeristic black masses that corporations have turned them into. But for the unfaithful, do you really have to pick a day of celebration to be so vocal with your unfaith? So if you take a stroll along the internet in the week leading up to some big day of Christian rejoicing, as I often do, you'll find a lot of hot takes. And because it is Easter, you could guess that we're looking at that in particular. Now, most of the takes on Easter, and Christmas for that matter, but again, not what we're talking about, relate to it being pagan or non-Christian in origin. And the attitudes around that range from church bad, insofar as co-opting idyllic pagan practices, to a different church bad, insofar as adopting heathen pagan practices.
Easter is the celebration of the Assyrian Babylonian goddess Ishtar.
This is Ishtar.
She is what you are really celebrating. She's also referred as the Queen of Heaven, which is Isis.
It was for the god of Ishtar. Isn't that crazy? Most people don't know that.
Easter was a pagan sexual orgy to celebrate the fertility of Ishtar.
Now, many researchers say that the name Easter derives from the other name of the moon goddess Semiramis, which is Ishtar, and that Easter is the correct pronunciation of this name, Ishtar, in Semitic dialect.
And it is the word Easter that proves that, because the word Easter comes from Ishtar. Ishtar. Who is Ishtar?
So the Ishtar thing is just the perfect invention. It's not very sportsmanlike of me even to include it. I just wanted something to lube up the way for the next one. I understand it as a folk etymology. It's the sort of thing that makes sense when you think about it for the first time. The pronunciation and the notion of fertility, but just some very simple geography is enough to disprove this one. I mean, look at Assyria on a map, and you'll see there's no way that that word and tradition made it over to England at the time. And as you'll see in just a second, the word Easter doesn't come from Ishtar. It comes from, well, I'll let them speak.
Ostara is a Germanic goddess of fertility, springtime, and the sunrise.
All about the pagan goddess Eostre, who is connected with this time of year. And Eostre, also known as Ostara, is the Germanic goddess of spring and the dawn.
Ostara symbols are the hare and the sparrow, as well as eggs and spring flowers, and it is said that wherever Ostara treads, flowers will grow.
Absolutely, I can talk about Ostara. I have my grimoire here for reference, so let's get started.
So this is at least a little more on the nose. Again, you get a lot of claims that the Christian tradition has co-opted pagan traditions. And the answer is usually kinda, a little, maybe. The claims are not 100% wrong, but they're exaggerated, misunderstood, and even their initial rhetorical purpose or philosophy is just incorrect. Anthropological realities don't have any room for plagiarism. The church never stole or co-opted anything in that regard. But when you're importing a religion onto people who already have things going on, you can't get a perfectly clean slate. Some things stick in name or in little aspects, but that doesn't detract from their Christian legitimacy. Anyway, I'll get into it. Yes, the name Easter does come from some element of Germanic faith. That's no secret. It's well-known history. Venerable Bede, that is Saint Bede, as in a person canonized by the church, so not something they're trying to hide, wrote about it. In fact, he is the one person who wrote about it. And before I get too into the details of that, you should know that he didn't even write that the festival was some pagan borrowing or adaptation, but simply that the word describing the month in which what we now call the Easter celebration occurred, that word came from a pagan faith element. Easter isn't what most of the world calls it, by the way. Most languages call it something like Pascha. That's from the Aramaic word for Passover. And so the connection to Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew, is more pronounced there. It's really only in English and in German from an English origin that the festival has this unusual name. Saint Bede, writing in the 8th century, was explaining why this name is used for what he also identifies as Paschal. He says the old name for the month, a name obviously in use prior to the import of Paschal, was called Eostermonth, a month named after the goddess Easter, much in the same way that the Romans had month names like January, March, and June after their deities. And because it was during this month that the Christian festival fell, they began calling the festival by that name, especially with the official month names from the Julian calendar coming in later, March and April, opening up a vacancy for, just the word Easter. It's really that simple, so far as the association goes, but if you really can't let go of it, let me complicate things further. Again, Bede wrote this for us, but he really is the only person to write it. To be clear, this is the only attestation of an Eostre, anywhere. I don't care what else you read. I don't care whether you've read about Ostara or some neo-pagan blog. Look up any scholarly writing that mentions Eostre or Ostara, or even just the Wikipedia page is fine, and you'll notice an asterisk next to the word Ostara. That little star is a common feature of etymology and comparative linguistics, and what it means is that the word is made up. thought to have existed but not attested anywhere. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that a word is illegitimate. Before writing, most words, just were unattested. The entire corpus of Proto-Indo-European, a linguistic special interest of mine, has stars next to it, because not a single word of the language was ever written down. But due to painstaking scholarship, comparative linguistics and phonology, archaeological mapping, and obsessively fastidious methods, a workable language is understood. But this Ostara doesn't come from a pre-writing time. I know these modern-day pagans love misappropriating runes, and there's not a single runic inscription of that god's name either. It's possible that no such goddess ever existed. Saint Bede, though, did think such a goddess existed, but he didn't provide any real evidence for it. The extent of his mention of it was 2 dependent clauses explaining that the month was named after a goddess, for whom feasts were had in said month. And I'm not saying that that's wrong either. I'm just saying that it's not certain. And if that kind of uncertainty exists, then people claiming to be carrying some ancient tradition, with the Ostara festival, are lying and celebrating nothing other than a tradition inspired by things they recognize from Christian Easter. But anyway, let's talk about the possibilities for what the goddess Ostara may have been. You could probably surmise that Ostara is in some way related to the word East, and yes, definitely. What that name and its association with the East means, we'll get into in a second. Now, again, Ostara is the only attestation of the name. Ostara is literally just imagining what the name may have looked like if it was referring to the thing they think it refers to in a language, Old High German, that may or may not have even used it. If you're a German speaker, you may be familiar with the word Ostern, and have therefore a little more faith in an Ostara. But in all likelihood, the Germans seem to have inherited the word from English. That is to say, English, monks, missions, using their word for Easter to describe it to the German people they were converting. And I'm not saying the English people, who of course migrated to England from something like northern Germany or Denmark in the first place, certainly didn't inherit the goddess from some early Pan-Germanic form, but with the evidence we do have, this form in German would seem likely to come from those monks. Again, I can't be certain, but you can't either, and some of these people are saying Ostara and even imposing specific traits and traditions onto her as though it's verifiable fact. So that's the more common idea of the goddess, that she was a Germanic goddess called Ostara. And whenever you see proponing of this theory, you'll see a nice little list that traces the word back to Proto-Indo-European roots. Listen, take it with a grain of salt. You can do this with most English words. That's just etymology. But there's something sinister to me about calling her a goddess that was worshipped in history right next to supplying a 5,000 or 6,000 year etymology of a word. It kind of implies that the history of the worship and the history of the word are one and the same, and they're just not. Yes, obviously there are dawn goddesses in Europe, but I just think there's zero case to be made for a definite and traceable lineage from the theoretical dawn goddess, who would later be realized as, Eos or Aurora in other languages, being the exact same, through line to this hypothetical Ostara. By the way, do you know the man who may have invented this theory with the Ostara business? Bede started it in passing, but someone who really picked up the torch and threw gasoline on it was Jacob Grimm. One of the fairy tale brothers. And don't get me wrong, he's a legit, linguist. Grimm's law, or the rule describing sound shifts from PIE to Proto-Germanic, is an immensely important work, in this type of field. But another thing you should know about Grimm is that he was incredibly invested in Germanness. Not that there's anything wrong with it per se, but he was a big nationalist. And a lot of the work he did, whether that's about the Germanic language's place in comparative linguistics or collecting folk stories, was very much interested in defining and admiring that which is German, or even purely German, that sort of distillate that can only be gathered from the soul of the people themselves when all of the additives of the Latinate tradition are removed. I have a great amount of historic respect for Jacob Grimm, but I'm just saying that a Germanic goddess being the origin of a Christian tradition is awfully convenient for his own worldview. But anyway, Ostara is a big theory, and the smaller theory of goddesshood is that our Ostara was not one goddess but 3. The triple goddess is something that is well attested across Europe. obviously the Fates and the Moirai and Erinyes and Nornir and Morrigan. But the theory here is not one of genre. It has real attestations, if we believe they refer to the same thing. In the Rhineland in Germany, there's a wealth of Roman inscriptions and dedications to the Matrones Ostriohenae. The matrones means mothers or matrons, and is typically the word used in this kind of triple goddess cult. Ostriohenae, no clue. Using the same rigorous level of logic as with Eostra, you can guess that it relates to the east or the dawn somehow, that Austrio. But you couldn't be certain how. Honestly, it could be a reference to a place, a people, just a sort of epithet meaning who knows what. But in any case, these were real goddesses worshipped by a cult, and it does seem to be a local cult, as the inscriptions aren't found outside of a very narrow geographic area. By the way, this cache of archaeology was found when excavating an old river dam, where the stone slabs have been repurposed in construction. But what to do with that info? It may honestly be a local cult whose existence completely faded out. It may be the local incarnation of a Germanic triple goddess. It may or may not have anything at all to do with Eostra. In fact, Eostra may not have been a god at all. St. Bede is absolutely fastidious with his writings on matters of the church. But keep in mind this reference he made to Eostra isn't a theological undertaking on Anglo-Saxon pagans. He's living thoroughly in Christendom and drawing off of sort of cultural memories. He may simply have gotten it wrong. He gives the Anglo-Saxon names of all the months, and some of them have to do with agricultural occasions, such as Weldmonath, weed month, Solmonath, soil month, or Thrimilchemonath, the 3 milk month, the month when cows produced the most milk. And there was a holy month, Haligmonath, an agricultural and holy month, Blotmonath, blood month, or the month before winter, where you'd be slaughtering a lot of animals. And then others had to do with relations to the solstices. 4 months are named either before or after midsummer and midwinter. Now, October's equivalent, perhaps the month that would have begun with the autumnal equinox, Now, October's month, perhaps the month that would have begun with the autumnal equinox, is called Winterfylith, or a winter full moon, the full moon marking the beginning of the other half of the year for the Anglo-Saxons. It's the month on the polar opposite of this one that is called Eostermonath. So this month alone is named after a deity while the others aren't. Well, historian and British Academy Fellow Ronald Hutton would disagree. He thinks this month simply means opening or beginning. It could have the same dawn-inspired etymology, but in the absence of a historical record of a goddess important enough to name a month after, I think the humbler aim is the truer one. If you've been counting months with me, you may have noticed that we're one shy of 12. Bede's other Anglo-Saxon month, the equivalent to March, was Hrethmonath. This is another that he claims to have been named after a deity. And that makes another deity attested nowhere else. Not once, never. It does take a little gravity away from Eostermonath being the only one named after a deity, but it's also possible he could have gotten this one wrong too. The Romans named this corresponding month Mars, which is actually after a god, but stay with me. Anyway, the reason the Romans named it that after their war god is because this was the time of year that Romans went out to war. Now, the word Hreth in Old English, again, not attested anywhere as a god, means honor, glory, or victory. Do you think it's more likely that there was not one, but 2 secret Germanic deities who were never recorded anywhere, not even by the Romans who wrote observations about the gods of various people, but only were preserved to present day based off the writings of a single Christian monk born a lifetime after England converted to Christianity? Or do you think he may have been slightly misinformed about something he wasn't terribly concerned with the particulars of? And the fact was that they named the warring month Honor and the pretty springtime month after blossoming flowers.
Why do we celebrate Easter? Why do you hide eggs and bunny rabbits? Well, think about what bunny rabbits are known for. Humping. Dude, you put 2 rabbits together, dude, next thing you know, there's 100.
It says the Easter hare, which is a rabbit. The Easter hare came to Christianity from antiquity. Now, replace Christianity with Catholicism. The Easter nonsense was never in true biblical Christianity. The Easter hare came to Christianity from antiquity. The hare is associated with the moon in the legends of ancient Egypt and other peoples. Through the fact that the Egyptian word for hare, or means open and period, the hare came to be associated with the idea of periodicity.
Ostara was a Saxon goddess of fertility, whose animal symbol was a bunny, because in nature, rabbits are known for their energetic breeding, which have traditionally symbolised fertility.
Does a white rabbit have to do with Jesus?
Here's what I'll say about the bunnies. Yes, they tend to be associated with fertility, and yes, that means they've been associated with Ishtar and possibly Ostara if she existed. Does that mean they're a part of Christian Easter for that reason? No. Here's another thing about the fertility of rabbits, or rather hares. The European hare can interestingly become pregnant while pregnant, which is to say, it can become pregnant with a second litter before having given birth to the first. In this observed phenomenon of the hares giving birth sometimes well before the expected date, you get the idea that would become related to parthenogenesis, like that of, Mary, Mother of God. And you see images of hares becoming a motif for Mary in medieval illumination. And in particular, we're talking about the European brown hare. Some further significance developed in depicting Mary as a white hare, which was sort of a subversion of the popular sentiment of the lustful hare, showing that she retained purity and resisted sexual temptation and bore a virgin birth. But fine, I can't argue that no trace of some pagan fertility deity didn't stick to the walls of the cultural consciousness in Europe. But I don't think that whatever deity that was really owns rabbits, like as a concept. Of course, they're going to have something to do with fertility and human imagination, and I'm sure that the ancestors of people who celebrate Easter probably celebrated some type of fertility festival around the same time as Easter, because it's springtime and that's when animals get horny. And sure, it may have involved rabbits because, one, they're also horny, and two, it's the fucking time of the year that a person sees rabbits outside.
They would then take chicken eggs that were fertilized and dip these chicken eggs in the blood of these babies.
Eggs are such a symbol of fertility, right? We call what we women have inside of our bodies our eggs because that's what they are. That's the word we use for them. And so this is a great symbol of fertility. This is a symbol of the seeds that we're planting, right? Because usually you start to sow your seeds, sow your oats, so to speak, in the ground during this season.
Now let's talk about the Easter eggs and Easter rabbits. Where do they come in? Both eggs and rabbits are symbols of fertility. Eggs actually played a big role in the pagan rituals that we spoke about earlier. After sacrificing the babies, they get the blood of the babies and use that to dye the eggs, which were then placed in rabbit nests. This is the origin story of Easter eggs.
So I have seen a claim that I have not seen substantiated that pre-Christian Germanic people buried eggs in the ground as sort of a fertility ritual. But the problem with reaching blindly into the past and grabbing something that feels familiar is that sometimes people just tend to do things. And unless you can see the path it made being dragged through the ages as a sustained tradition, it may mean nothing at all. Eggs are a lot like the bunnies. You mean to tell me that people sometimes think about eggs in relation to fertility? No way! Of course, eggs are a fertility symbol in some cultures. It's almost inherent. But we need more to establish the grandiose cause and effect claim that these people are making. Some more relevant information on eggs does lead us to some cause and effect. Lent, the Christian fasting season, used to be taken much more seriously than it is by many nowadays. It was not uncommon to forgo not just red meat, not just all animal flesh, but also any animal products. They literally go vegan for Lent. And obviously what comes after a fast is a feast. You want to break the fast in a big way, rewarding your discipline and theologically celebrating the resurrection of Christ. And if you can't eat eggs for 40 days, you're going to want them. Luckily, eggs keep pretty well. So the eggs the hens have been producing are all there waiting for you. This is also where the coloring of eggs comes in. Because eggs were a popular Lent-breaking food, they became sort of a gift given for Easter. Initially, this was done among the wealthier classes, and being gifts, they were naturally decorated. Red for the blood of Christ, a bright green to represent rebirth, and even beyond that, these things were lavishly decorated. Towards the end of the High Middle Ages in England, we have records of nobility sending large quantities of eggs decorated with gold leaf and fine pigments. This tradition eventually made its way into lower classes as well. Keep in mind that meat was much more expensive and inaccessible to many in the Middle Ages than it is today. So some people couldn't afford meat to decadently break their fast, which supported the eggs' role therein. But you also get a phenomenon whereby eggs were given to the poor as a sort of charity for this time of year. This idea of wanting fellow Christians to have something of a feast, even if they can't afford meat. And if you have chickens laying eggs that you're not allowed to eat for 40 days, you may have some to spare for the less fortunate. It was in this sort of climate that the modern Easter traditions developed. Ultimately, it was mostly the Germans who developed the distinct modern Easter imagery. The hare was, of course, associated with Mary and with that time of year, but the Germans developed the caricature of the Easter hare. That tradition can be taken back to 1500 or so. They also seem to have developed the Easter egg hunt for children. Now, I'm not sure whether that is exclusively their invention or not, but they have the oldest traces I can find of the tradition. Also, some early descriptions of it seems to imply that men would hide eggs for women as well as children, which is neat. But yeah, take these conspiratorial party-pissing claims with a grain of salt, always. Anytime you hear someone espousing what they might claim to be hidden knowledge, you should be skeptical of it. Most of the time, the vocal ones haven't read anything real anyway. They've just heard a synthesis from someone else and have no interest or ability in fact-checking or even thinking something out. And I like harebrained conspiracies, don't get me wrong, but we should at least try to punch up with those. Saturnian pedophiles, I'm there, and I'm violent. But Easter or Christmas, fuck off. I don't care what fake trauma you have that stems from you thinking you're smarter than 2 millennia worth of Christian thought. They're nice. They're fun times, even if you don't agree with the theology. And as a final note, try as we may, we'll never really reconnect with pre-Christian Europe. Honestly, such a thing hardly existed. Whatever you read about pagan pantheons and cosmology is terribly synthesized, adulterated, amalgamated, misappropriated, hypothesized, reconstructed fantasy. Look at some primary sources sometimes. Whatever you're getting online has been stitched together from fragmentary remains of very different people who would have sooner fought each other to death than broke bread and celebrated some faggy little neo-holiday. The pan-Germanic thing is a fantasy. Even the neat Norse pantheon is bullshit. I said look at primary sources, but honestly, even most of those were written hundreds of years after the fact by people with religious biases and creative minds. If you really like spirituality so much, just learn a little more about the holidays you're so quick to bash. You'll find that most of what you like in the neo-pagan fake traditions has just been reactionarily extracted out of the Christian holiday.
What's Easter? Easter's an old white sex god. Got nothing to do with Jesus, the black revolutionary Messiah, the black son of the living God, the black Messiah, the black Redeemer. Does a white rabbit have to do with Jesus? What does a white man with a red suit on have to do with Jesus? This fella gets more play than Jesus.